Welcome to Iris Lapinski, friend of mine, social entrepreneur and pioneer that goes back 2007 when we started off in the disruptive social innovators somewhere in London. And you've come an amazingly long way with a fab career. And I'm really pleased and I'm honored to have you on this podcast with me today. I'd like to pass it across to you to just tell everybody a little bit about your background, yourself, and whatever exciting things you're working on now and what's coming this year.
Thank you. Well, great to be here. So I think, and I'm sure you know that, it's like I have a slightly eclectic background. So I grew up in Germany and then I tried doing an electronic engineering degree, dropped out of that, did languages and social sciences and ended up in London at some point doing a master's in human rights. And then from there, I did a whole range of things like working in Belgium as a sustainability analyst, working on consulting projects in sub-Saharan Africa, doing stuff for pension providers on corporate governance and sustainability. So I then did lots of different things. And I think by the time we met, I'd sort of figured out that I'm pretty good at doing business models and I'm really interested in social enterprise. So not just analyzing what others are doing. I think when being a sustainability analyst, I'd read about 1,000 CSR reports. And the last thing I could look at was flowers and children over flowers when it was a tech company or telecoms company. I got lots of anger when I saw those things. So I decided I want to do practical things. And through sort of a coincidence, I met a very successful social entrepreneur who came out of Brazil and the Mexican guy who helped him in London. So that was Rodrigo Baggio. And we then came up with a feasibility study to create a new version of what he was doing in Brazil, which then turned into Apps for Good, which still runs today as a technology education nonprofit, has reached, a few 100,000 students in Portugal and about 30,000 in the UK every year now. So that still runs. I left my executive role about 5 years ago and then I think 1 or 2 years ago stepped down from the board. So I'm now very much sort of an advisor in the background. And when something is tricky, I still support. But otherwise, Portugal is running amazingly well with Zhao and Natalie runs the UK. So that's great. So I then did a few other things. One was a very big nonprofit network called Junior Achievement, which is around entrepreneurship education. And then I also did a short stint running the Germany office for the B Corp movement. And as the last thing, what I'm doing now is I'm a venture coach for a global fellowship program. Most of the team sit in Berlin, but we have venture coaches in South Africa, in India, in Ecuador, in Colombia, etc., so that they serve really a global group of fellows who want to create their own environmental projects. So my fun bit is now I get to help others to create their own things from scratch, as I did in 2009. And the other things I'm doing, I will talk about that a little bit as well. I've been a trustee of a privately led foundation operating in Burkina Faso called TuaRes Foundation, where that is funded primarily by one person with his own money. But I think part of how he's funding it, I think that could be a model for many other people to actually fund things. That is sort of my background and the things that I think might be relevant for the conversation.
That's one reason why I wanted us to speak, because you've covered a lot of ground, but you also have, a compelling amount of experience in establishing and running social enterprises, non-profit, and obviously once you're on boards and an advisory and consulting things, you can end up on both sides of that fence. But in this conversation, I want to dig into your experiences of, funding, being on the receiving end of funding. And so I think it would be fabulous to learn from you, because you can apply that broader lens to the experience of receiving funding, which a lot of non-profit leaders may not be able to do because their experience is limited to non-profits. So I think I'm particularly interested to see how your insights differ, but also how they've built upon that first-hand experience that you've had. So I think that's a good place for us to start then. Let's dive into the positive side of things, which is, helpful funding approaches, conditions, behaviors, structures that over your career really helped you and the organizations that you've worked with to thrive, to feel good, to innovate, to do more powerful things. So what would you say are your 3 or 5 of those that stand out for you over your career?
So I tried to list them on an abstract level, and then I also have a few examples. And I think for the positive examples, it's fair to talk about specific funders as well.
Absolutely. I think it's important that if you have good practices, that they are openly shared and you should receive fair recognition for them. So yeah, absolutely.
So I think the thing I noted down in terms of sort of get started with like what makes basically a helpful and good funder. And it's like, I'm sure I don't remember everything because some of it was a while ago. But one of the things we always used to come back with, and I think also with, all of the other things I've seen with Junior Achievement and with B-Lab, ultimately, what do you want a funder to be is that they have longer term significant commitment and really an alignment for what you're trying to achieve in terms of impact.
And what do you say is longer term? When you say longer term, what term are we talking?
Yeah, and that why I say I think that depends, but it really depends on the time frame of the intervention that you're doing. So if you're doing, and for Apps for Good, our minimum commitment was always like you join us at least for a school year. Why? Because we ran the core thing as for an academic year. Obviously, it'd be nice to tell schools already in spring that they can join, and it'd be good to have a follow-on. So it might not be exactly 12 months, but you want to have sort of one cycle of intervention. With TuaRes Foundation, that is very different because there the commitment is to say actually, and Reinhard has been extremely good at that, to say, if I accept girls into the primary school program, my commitment is, as long as they do well, I continue supporting them through their educational path. Because my aim is that I change their path. So funding a girl for 2 years in primary school and then stopping, I've set a massive amount of expectations. I've increased hopes for people who might be struggling getting other opportunities. So I have an obligation to follow through on that commitment. That does not mean, and actually like on the board, we've done that quite a bit. It's like every time when there was a decision not to continue in one location, it wasn't a hard cut, it was a soft cut. So no new girls would be added to the program. So the funnel stopped. Those who were in the program continue to progress. As I said, like some of them dropped out. Yes, that happens, but it didn't come from the foundation. And I think if you think about, what's your moral obligation when you're a funder, you're putting money in, you have influence, but you also increase hopes and expectations. And I think you need to be aware of that. And you need to, as I said, it doesn't mean like, I think Reinhard is an extreme case because he's literally prepared. If he starts at primary school age, he funds until the end of university education. If the girl makes it. Not many do it up to university education. That's like the pipeline gets small, but that is ultimate commitment. I do think for other funders, because I'm aware that, people do have typically like every 3 to 5 years a strategy review and want to do new things, etc.
That's an arbitrary position.
It's an arbitrary thing. But I think even if you had that, I think it's then your obligation to say, okay, if I think I only fund primary education, you are honest about that so that there is no misconception. And it's also, I think, your duty to then figure out together with the organization how you can pass them on to someone else who might have that focus on secondary education or on university level or vocational training or whatever. Like if that is not your thing, that's fine. I don't think that's a problem, but I do think you need to be aware of that. And that's what I mean. It's like, you need to have some sort of connection between the time frame of the intervention and what you're actually funding so that those are in sync. So I think that was sort of the biggest point I could come up with because it's like for Apps for Good, it was easy, but I think for others, that is really important.
I want to pick up on that specifically because that's a really great point. I like the way that you've framed it as a recognizing a moral obligation and the fact that once you intervene, even in a positive way, you fundamentally change expectations, and letting people down off those expectations can be quite significantly damaging. Before they had it was what it was. Once you build, especially children up or even communities up, pulling out with no backup plan or no. I really like the fact that you put those two examples together. Not just the idea that you fund over the time frame of that intervention, but the fact that if you change geographies or something is changing, you are not then bailing out on the people that you had committed to funding in the first place. So you're making sure that continues to play out. All you are doing is now moving, but you have not abruptly suddenly changed it for somebody else because your plans changed. And again, I'll make the point, those are always arbitrary. I mean, there may be a good reason, a political change or some kind of regulatory change or something like that that's out of your control. Fair enough. But I think as an example, should really be highlighted and picked up and showcased as an excellent practice that is respectful and considerate of the people whose lives we intervene with, and that idea of a 3 to 5 year change of plan does become a massive issue when the time frame of the actual outcome is significantly longer than 3 to 5 years. We see it all the time. So yeah, that is a brilliant, and I love the way that you had a good example of that as well. Because, a lot of people might think of this as something that's a concept. Wouldn't it be great if? And so I'm a massive fan of demonstration models. So if somebody already has that in play, we've already come out winning from this podcast. So, okay, what else? That's one. Excellent. What's another helpful thing?
So I think just to add a little bit on that, and like one of the reasons why I'm saying that is like, if you think about whatever you do from the perspective of the beneficiary or the person who's impacted, what you obviously do is like you set expectations, but you also set requirements, right? So I can give you for the girls, the requirement is that they study and they work hard and they try their best to do good exams on top of all the other things that are being provided. So obviously, if the girl continues to do that, you have a commitment with them, right? Because if they fail and if they don't continue, I don't think it's your moral duty to continue, because you said, this is my precondition on how I want you to do well, and this is why I'm giving you that. But as I said, I think if you think it from that perspective, also just terminating halfway through your education, if you look at it from that way, it doesn't make sense, and it is unfair to do.
I think it's more than unfair because, and this is true for all of us, not just people in, vulnerable situations who would not have had those hopes at all, is the impact of those letdowns. They can be derailing for your entire life. They can fundamentally change who you trust and how you trust and what you believe in and what you take seriously for the rest of your life. And you can end up being horribly derailed by that change or by that arbitrary switch, or where somebody or something you believed in has now let you down. And I think it's very easy for people whose lives are generally in a good place to forget that. But if they look back at their lives, they will see that even for children who have everything, those letdowns can be significantly derailing, as it can be for young adults and, adults in general, but certainly from the child to the young adult continuum, the effect of being let down by people that set you up to believe in them can be pretty harmful.
In a way, what you're then doing is because there's a lot of stuff obviously around research around neuroscience. It's like you're moving away from training for hope, but you actually there's the concept of trained hopelessness. So what you're actually unattendedly doing, you're training for hopelessness, because you get hopes up and then you crash them, and then you do that a few times, or different people do it a few times, and then you basically don't even start getting up your hopes because you'll be disappointed.
And you don't even have to do it a few times, and so there's a term that I coined some time ago, which I used in a lot of projects, is threshold of harm. I think a lot of people will design projects without considering, the potential and threshold of harm to that demographic, and both in terms of, so like when you just go in and experiment on people, or you go in without having done your own due diligence to build your own capability, and, you just come in with some half-baked thing, and threshold of harm can vary in many different ways, including knowledge being harmful. There's a certain level of understanding and knowledge where the thing becomes functional and useful. And underneath that, again, you can have problems. But I feel this is another interesting aspect to understanding the potential for harm when you embark on helping people. So that's also that commitment aspect, which has to be maintained. So I think it's a brilliant point. Do you have anything else any other nuances?
No, I think at the moment, that was the only one, as I said, because I do think it always helps to look at it from the angle of the beneficiary. And, ultimately, yes, there are always organizational constraints, but, if you lose track of that angle, then you don't really stand a chance to make a difference. Let's say it that way.
Well, I mean, in your experience, how many projects or funders would you say have genuinely had a demographic as their core point of focus versus a service, for example.
I don't think you need to have that as a funder. So I think in a way that takes me to the second thing. I think the good funders I've seen use the funding relationship, or they think about it as a relationship to create a learning journey. So, a good funder, yes, they would push you to create a solid plan beforehand and to spell out what you actually want to do and to challenge you on that and say, listen, based on what we've seen, this is realistic or this is not realistic. And that can be super helpful because obviously when I started out with Apps for Good, I'd never run a nonprofit organization. I'd never internationalized a nonprofit organization. So you do rely on people. And one really great example who helped us really from the start was, and I put it down in my notes, is Esme Fairbairn Foundation. And our contact there was Derek Bardowell, who now runs another amazing organization. So he was always really good in challenging us. But then also once they had decided to fund us, and they did multiple times, they would give us the freedom to do stuff then and get out of our way. And they were always very good because we had regular check-ins with him to understand that, even your best plan will not work out. Even your best intended plan will not work out. And having that acknowledgement and saying, okay, we work with you and we are on this together. So it's not just I'm you're my minion because I give you money and you promised something and you can't execute on it. So it's your fault, which I also had. But really take the reverse approach. And another, I think, great example of that is, so at some point we decided we want to build a technology platform to become more scalable and more effective and to serve more schools and students. And I had no clue about digital product development. Zero. And I had a guy in the team who was a developer, but in terms of product development was at least as clueless, if not worse, as I was. So our first platform, we got funding for that from the Nomina Trust. And our first platform was on a scale of 0 to 10 was a 0 because it could have 5 concurrent users at the time. We had already about 1,000 students. So 5 concurrent users was sort of a problem. And in the first week of launching, it got hacked and porn was posted on that platform. And obviously that is a platform to serve teachers and students in schools. So it was a total car crash. So I had to go back to Annika Small, who at that point ran the Nomina Trust, and said, Annika, you know what? This is a total car crash. This is so bad. I've brought in an external consultant, John Rotham. He looked at it and said, this is unfixable. The only thing you can do is to switch it off and start again from scratch. So obviously I wasn't particularly keen to have that conversation, but I felt it's I'd much rather have because it was so bad. There was no point even pretending that it was good. But I also had to go to her and said, I can't remember what it was. I think initially it was £75,000 we got. And we had by that point spent between 40 to 50, I'd say. So definitely more than half. So I had to go back to her and say, we're going to switch it off. I have a plan on how to fix it and with how we're going to go about it. But the truth is I need more money to actually do it. And for her benefit, she accepted the fact that this was a total car crash. She didn't kill me for it. She appreciated that I was so honest about it. And then my requirement was, she said, I will give you more money if you show me the solid plan and what you're going to do and what the things are you going to put in place to not repeat the first experience. But I have also another requirement, and that is you write a public article about what you have learned and how you would go about differently. And I said, yeah, happy to do it. And it was quite funny because then that article got published on the Nomina Trust website. And there was this period over a few months where a lot of other nonprofit CEOs just basically pinged me and said, could we have a coffee? Don't want to go down your route and I'd really want to learn from what are the steps I should do to not get into the same mess. Yeah, so I think that's another example of really a funder seeing this as a learning journey and, not killing you for, in hindsight, we should have not be as...
What's interesting about that, it comes back also to that question of in terms of helpfulness. Sometimes considering what the use of that money could be for, which is expertise in kind as well. It's making sure that if you're anyway going to lose 40,000 or 50,000 pounds on learning for the organization, maybe they have a better policy of bringing for these kind of outside the organization's primary domain type work, potentially bringing on pairing it with consultants or capability or expertise or people that could not just mentor. I think more than mentor. I feel like mentoring is all well and good if people have capabilities that they can utilize. But I think you sometimes need a mix of both mentoring and actual, getting involved in the design and the production and so on and so forth. Because this is a great example of something that just unlocks an organization's ability to just move to another level. It's not necessarily a capability that they are going to keep reutilizing year after year after year, into the future of their operation. So someone comes in and helps you along, and there's a trusted relationship between the funder, yourself, and that player. It also takes the pressure off you to have to try and finance that player directly. And their accountability changes a little bit. What do you think of that? Do you think that might have helped you?
I think so. My recommendation in that article was, when you build a house, you don't just bring in the builders and start building stuff, right? So you typically go for an architect and someone who can design a thing from the start. So my advice was any technology build you do, you have to reserve, I'd say, at least 15% of the total amount to get a product person in. And I do think about it actually as 2 steps. So when we brought in John Rotherham, he had whatever it was, 15, 20 years experience of product development. He wasn't cheap because those type of people can't cheap.
That's the point. And I think as a founder's got to recognize that is a relatively significant cost. But then those things work well.
Yeah. But then the other thing is, so you have that first phase, and typically when you set up anything really new, whether that's a risk management system and you've never done it, or even a financial management system, or as I said, a product development function, you need to get someone in who's done it before so that you're not all making all of the basic mistakes that, you can look at and say, this was obvious. They're the unobvious mistakes, but they're the obvious ones you shouldn't do. But then once you have a first version out of that with someone senior, what you can and what you should do, you should grow your in-house capabilities to maintain and evolve it. So we then, one of the things we actually did, because finding really good product people is really tricky. And as I said, Lon was excited to do it for a while, also at a discounted rate, but there was no way we could hire him long term. But what we then did is we basically had people in the organization who had quite a big interest in that space. So we actually trained them up. And at some point, also intentionally, we then had lots of different head of products over the years, people who came to us from Google, but then only stayed a year. And what I've learned is when you need to rethink a big piece, you probably need someone externally and you need someone experienced. But all you want to do is you have a plan and you want to execute it and you want to move so slightly sideways or maybe a little bit upways, then you actually don't want to have those people because
absolutely.
When they come in, they create a new product roadmap. Again and again and again. And the last thing that you need at that point then is a new product roadmap. You just need someone to say, okay, we have a plan. We're going to execute on that for the next 12 months, 18 months, whatever it is. So I think there is sort of that interplay that every time when you have to do a significant step up, you have to bring in that expertise from outside. But once you've done that step, then it's far more cost effective and it's far more effective in general than just to build in-house capacity. And then you can also address the problem that you typically have as a nonprofit is how do you give career opportunities to your team?
Absolutely.
To your people? And that is a very easy way to do it because then they can learn from someone. They're not going in blind. And as I said, we always had people who were interested in learning more about product development. So we had a guy who initially joined on the fundraising side, who then became a product person. We had a guy who initially did content development, who became a product person. We had one girl who did initially impact and data management and became a product person. We have different paths because anyone who has an interest can become a digital product person. Yeah. So I think that's sort of going back to what the funders can do. If they really help you to see that as a learning journey. Annika was also smart enough when I then said, and we now spend whatever it was, 15,000 or more on that review because we had to get an honest review. She was fine with that as well.
Yeah. I think we speaking a similar language, right? Where the funder can play quite an important role to unlock a level for you, whereas that's the difference between someone that can come in, just unlock a level, and then you carry on with that execution and you build your capability along that line. But that unlocking of the level, that's an expensive proposition, right? Because the skill required for that is you don't want to hire that skill because once that's been done, there's no real utility for them. Or they keep trying to unlock new levels, which again is just not something that your enterprise needs, like not at development time. But this is something that I've always maintained as well, which is when you're providing money, you've got to consider that disproportionate cost of things that unlock a level for organizations. It's not the standard, it's not the standard delivery cost of just having in-house teams trying to do that piece. Yeah, so that's a great point about helpful practices where the funder is willing to genuinely look at what the needs are, to appreciate the fact that teams are learning and growing, and some of these things don't work out as people intended. With the best intention, that was the best that you were going to do. And to be able to recognize that people tried hard, they gave it their best, didn't work out, cut losses and let's start again. Or let's not cut losses, but try and find a way to learn from that, gain from that, and then build again. And then I'm assuming the next round went much better.
Yeah, it did work much better. Well, I think if I had done exactly those same mistakes, then I think rightfully, people would have told me, you know what, you're probably not capable of doing it. So then you need to rethink what you're doing.
It lends to the point that learning and investing in learning and supporting that benefits. You know what I mean? It's not like you go through that, you do it once, you fail, you come back, take money, do it again, you make a mess of it, do it again, make a mess of it. That would be highly unproductive. But yes, I feel like that realizing that there can be the odd step back, for organizations you fund is an important part of what you mentioned earlier, a good relationship.
It's also especially, if you're trying, some is are those technical things, but if you're genuinely trying to change something really hard that many people have tried before to do. The truth is, if it was simple and it was easy, it would be solved by now. So I do think it can be more iterations of learning, but that's what I mean. It's like your mindset need to be, we are learning on this and we don't want to have the same mistakes repeated. And that's why, you can do retrospectives and you can really feed into that as a learning process to not keep running and never look at all the things that fell to the wayside. But I genuinely do. I always told my team, if we're trying something completely new, my expectation is it takes 3 iterations to get it pretty okay. We do the first iteration and half of it works what we thought should work. We're pretty good. If it's a third, if we're 75 or 100%, that is total luck or amazing, or we don't have the right data. And then for the second iteration is that obviously it needs to be better than the first, and we shouldn't be repeating the same mistakes, but there might be new mistakes because we're now on a different level. And then I typically said, after we've done the third round, and that's why, for an annual program like us, a 3-year commitment was meaningful because by year 3, we could have iterated out of all the basic mistakes. But as I said before, other timeframes don't have that annual rhythm. So if you need 3 iterations to get it right, and each iteration takes 3 years, you're effectively looking at a 10-year horizon nearly to get to a meaningful iteration point.
Not something that I think funders really have wrapped their head around. I think that going back to that where you began this conversation about thinking about timeframes that are suited to whatever the outcome, that the funding timeframe should be related to the outcome timeframe, whatever that outcome timeframe is. And I think that's actually just maybe a good way for us to segue in the fact that most funders don't in fact operate like this. They're operating their own timeline, irrespective of what it is that nonprofits are doing. Could be a good way for us to segue into some of the behaviors that you found less helpful. Unless you had something that you really wanted to share from the helpful end.
I think I'll throw in one other thing because I think it links really well to, what we've already discussed. And I think it's quite quick. So, obviously there is a distinction in nonprofit funding between restricted funding, unrestricted funding. And restricted funding is typically what most organizations get. Unrestricted funding is typically extremely precious. And the issue with restricted funding is not necessarily that it is restricted, but that it is only restricted to a very small part of operational delivery typically. So what a lot of funders want to fund is field staff on the ground, running workshops or something. What most funders are not particularly or many funders are not happy funding with is core costs, so-called core costs, i.e. operational capabilities. And I don't think you have to take an either or thing. Like, Esme Fairbairn always, I actually look back at it, they always gave us restricted funding. But, and that's a big but, we had, in order to get to that restriction, it was our choice to choose what we wanted to do. And they were very keen and explicit on funding core costs, or initially like funding the feasibility study without having a legal setup, because they also said, like, if you do something for the first time, we give you a small pot of money to basically just experiment. So you can do restricted funding. I've also seen it in another way with the Google Impact Challenge that we won. Technically it was unrestricted, but they created sort of a middle tier, and that was called designated funding. So from an accounting perspective, it showed up in our books as unrestricted, but obviously we had created a very clear plan on what we actually wanted to do with it. Because it was designated, you don't then have to go through a massive process of reapproval to get funds changed. But because it was technically unrestricted but designated, when we came back and say, we've done this, we've realized we need to change it, then that change was faster. So as I'm not a big unrestricted or restricted thing. Yes, in an ideal world, everything would be unrestricted. But the truth is funders do want to have some control, but I think it's about being smart on how you play out that control and how you get to that restriction, or whether you say actually we'll do this thing around designated funding, which before working with Google, I think I never heard, and I've never heard since, to be honest.
That's such a good example and such a clever middle ground, right? The fact that, the money is restricted, but because that restriction is really just what you decided to be restricted to as a designated fund, that's basically the same as just being accountable for a commitment. This is a commitment. This is kind of what we need to use that money for. These are the different aspects of its spend. We agree that those aspects are sensible. It's not restricted to either just handing over to beneficiaries, or it's not just restricted to field staff delivering classes or training. I think that's a great illumination. I think will be very interesting to a lot of funders. A model that could be a good transition point as well as you move from the journey of being a very restricted funding type organization. This can be because your boards and other players that's just where they're at. And then that transition to genuine unrestricted funding could have this as a good middle ground, but also may never need to go up that curve if it's doing its job properly. I love it. That's a great.
So I think that was my last thing on the good practices, but I felt that was important.
Totally. That was totally worth it. I love it. I don't even know if we need to move on to unhelpful things. We've already gained a lot, but I think it might be interesting. Partly the reason why I have this little bit in the middle is that it can lead us into a good way to think also about the future of funding and how it incorporates some of these helpful things, but how it also, I guess, counters or sidesteps some of these unhelpful practices. I think what might be interesting is, I guess, to think about or see if you can, from your list, think of some unhelpful practices that are not already being covered in the helpful. You see what I mean with the helpful being a counter to that. Is there anything on your list?
I think the one thing which I had as a positive thing, but which we haven't covered, but I also have as a negative thing, is that really trying to get something out of this partnership that is not aligned with the vision. We've covered that a little bit. And we did have funders who, at the end of the day, what they wanted to get out was primarily employee volunteering opportunities and primarily PR. And in a way, the students, their learning, and the teachers were just sort of a way to get there, really. And that's why that can be really irritating because, the priorities are sort of wrong. We definitely had nothing against PR, and we never had anything against employee engagement, but you don't optimize for that. If you need to, you optimize for beneficiary success and benefits there. So I think that is sort of a thing where, and that typically what I've seen, I haven't really seen that much with foundations. I've seen that primarily with corporate partners, corporate foundations, or really direct corporates giving you money, where that can get really weird because the marketing team have a different mission from what you have.
Maybe there's an implication there about where that funding decision-making sits in that organizational landscape may also be part of that, right? If it's sitting with marketing, for example, then does that naturally lend itself more? Is that part of the continuum of that unhelpful practice, or is that not?
I think it can be a higher risk. I think it, with corporates, it really depends whether they're able to sort of take a step back as well. And as I say, take your perspective. And I've seen very marketing driven companies who were able to take that step back, and I've seen others who were not. And then I think that then links to my second point. If that's your primary mission is to get marketing out of it or employee engagement, what I've then also seen to make it worse is when people, keep coming with additional requests in that area that you might have agreed on, you do 2 or 3 things for them in the year for the amount that they're giving you funding, but that they come back and request more and request more. And because initially you think, oh, maybe they'll give us more money in the next year, so we'll do them a favor. When you're then into year 2 or year 3 of the partnership, what you realize is you're actually losing money on that account rather than making any money for the organization. Or the people you want to serve. And, you're still running, and maybe not a for-profit enterprise, but you're still running an enterprise, and which means if you lose too much money, you go bankrupt. So if you have those type of funders, and we did switch off at least one of them intentionally, like we said, we can't continue with you. We don't want to work with you because the amount of money you give us and the number of requests you have and the fact that, quite frankly, at the end of the day, you do not care about what we actually do with students and teachers on the ground. We'd rather not have your money.
What kind of requests? Do you remember what some of these requests were? Like what kind of thing did they come up?
So in terms of employee engagement, I can give you a very concrete one. So we ran a fair amount of events before the pandemic. So we had an annual awards thing. We also had more local things. And as part of that, we always try to bring in employees from our partners to engage with the students. So to do master classes, to run sessions with them, etc. And when you get the right type of person, those things can be valuable for both sides. But if you then get people sent who are extremely boring and not capable of running a session, and that doesn't happen once, but that happens multiple times, even though you give the feedback that maybe they should be more careful about who they send your way. And then students come back and they say, what was this? And you're like, that was our corporate partner sending an employee who wasn't really up to scratch. Then it becomes actively harmful.
So there's an ethic there, which is that, if you are playing that role where where you're taking an active participation in interacting with or impacting beneficiaries, then again, thing goes back to that moral obligation piece, which is that we're then obliged, really, we should feel obliged to make sure you're sending good people, people that are competent, that know what they're doing, or you don't make that commitment. And it's a bit like sending juniors to comment, because the junior has time free, but was not the agreement. You know what I mean? Even for capacity building organizations, you see this quite a bit, right? That people will send in Harvard, somebody will send in some MBA students after promising good, capable McKinsey. I'm going to get a McKinsey guy who's going to come in, and then, it's an analyst 1 year out of their MBA, and assuming that they're now going to come in and advise someone like yourself, who is a competent and capable enterprise leader across from business, social, and so that I think there's definitely a missing sense of perspective around that, but also that sense of obligation that says that we got to send our best because this has affects somebody's life somewhere down the line. I feel like that ethos is very much missing.
Yeah. Well, we in a way had the flip side. So we sometimes got extremely senior people who were obviously so far away from the students that they were basically living in a different world. So for us, sometimes having an MBA students actually would have been useful.
So maybe there's a requirements gathering and, an establishment piece that somebody needs to think about. And again, I feel like sometimes if this is your core capability as a company, it makes sense to just provide that sense check to a nonprofit. The nonprofit may not have realized that requirements provision is a thing. You know what I mean? So again, there's that piece of playing a role where you are looking to be as helpful as possible. And I've worked certainly with a lot of consultancy companies where people have genuinely taken. I remember we had 2 people came from Deloitte once, and they were so thoughtful. They sat down, really made sure they asked the right questions. They tried to make us look at our plans and think, well, hold on, that's not really going to work for you. Or have you considered this? Or, we're going to bring some people in, but I don't think they're going to be right for you. And maybe we should go back and have another chat with so, it's very much a doable, a doable thing if they bring their own client facing attitude to this relationship for many of them.
I'll give you one additional fun story and then we move to the next thing. So we also, obviously, because we did a lot of stuff with digital devices, we had a lot of different hardware manufacturers over the years. So we started with Dell. We then had BlackBerry as a partner before they went bankrupt. We had Samsung at some point. We initially gave students access on loan to digital devices. So people obviously then, like, what happened in the company is, oh, this is really interesting. Can't we do market research? And I remember at some point from one of those companies we got, I think it was like a 50-page survey that we were supposed to give through the teachers to all of the students to collect feedback.
For their benefit or for your benefit?
No, for their benefit. So we were obviously, since we were in a way the middleman or the mediator between those audiences, we're like, that sounds like a great idea, probably from your perspective, but this type of survey, we can't, without burning a massive amount of social capital and credibility, we can't put that in front of teachers and students. If you want to do market research, pay people, pay them directly and go through the normal market research channels. Don't abuse us for that type of use case. And so we then at the end, because we also didn't fully want to say no, because it was at that point like a good partner and an important partner, we said, okay, listen, what are the 3 questions that you really want to get answered? So the 3 questions we can handle, like 50 questions we can't. And we're also sure you're never going to use that data in the first place. So we then boiled that down and then we got that feedback. But I think that's around, what are you trying to get out of it? And also sometimes, the people who build that relationship in the corporate, they have the right intentions. But then especially if things are going well, then, other interests come in that can be interesting, let's say it that way.
It's tough as well, like, if you look at it from their perspective, sitting in closed walls of, of their own world and their own life, to have any idea of where all the stuff is going and because they have no real experience of what all that looks like in real life, right? There's such a wide gap between high resource environments and operation and low resource environments and operation that if you've never come through or spent any time in that low resource environment, you have no frame of reference. You don't even know that that's a thing, that it's possible that there isn't a concierge department in the company, in the organization that does all the hotel bookings. It's just what you take for granted. And, having been management consultant myself, I could easily see how that happens. You can take sums of money for granted that are crazy. You start working with, I remember when I was at Logica, £5 million projects were the projects that were given to graduates, right? So if you're a grad, there's a £5 million project. That's basically what came to you, because the big projects were 200 to 500 million projects, after which another set of organizations like CSC took over. When I then went from there to the first smaller consultancy, where their projects were, £700,000 was a large amount of money. It's quite a big mental adjustment, because although I've never seen 700,000, I've never seen £100,000 in my life. But the psychology of what's small or big is also twisted by the norms of your experience. That you can end up with somebody thinking, well, 50, it's fine, no problem. Some marketing person will go out there and then we'll just collect it. It's a bit of a shock to find that 3 is about as many as anyone's going to cope with in real life. So next, what's next on you?
So I think the only other one I'm going to add, and I think that's more like a theoretical one, but looking back, one of the things I probably regret most in terms of how we set up and how we structured Apps for Good is that we actually, because it was so easy for us to get funds from foundations, from corporates, we did it a little, but it was never serious as soon as we found got any pushback on some of the stuff, to really find a more user-based income model. And that short term is it's so much easier to get 50K from a corporate than to get 5,000 from teachers. But ultimately, what you miss out on is that ongoing serious feedback link, because if someone pays you money, they give you feedback in a totally different way on what is useful for them or not. And you also lose out on a certain degree, even if it just at the end of the day makes up 10%, 20%, maybe 30% of your revenues, you lose out on a lot of that sort of independence and commercial mindset if you're purely grant dependent. And I do think I've never seen any of the funders that I've worked with ever really push us for that in a serious way. But I do think that looking back at it now, it was sort of a grave omission not to do it. We did try it a little bit with, charging private schools, but not public schools. And there was sort of a moral case to make there. Commercially, it didn't make sense because we spent more staffing time and resources on collecting invoices than on actually the money we generated. So we stopped it completely. But I do think, and that's part of what we're now trying to do. And I do think, especially, even though it might have changed in the UK now as well, but especially if I'm now coaching fellows in South Africa or in Kenya or in Uganda, the truth is you cannot build any type of model on a grant-only model if you're in your right mind, basically. So you always have to go for a hybrid model. A lot of, I had a chat with one of the fellows, in Kenya, we're looking at sort of renewable energy and stuff. He's now engaging with an organization that focuses on renewable agriculture, and they have a hybrid model. So they get some grant stuff, but they also make sure they provide services to farmers and seeds and stuff that makes them money. And that is not only an afterthought. It actually, I do think it significantly shifts how your organization works, etc. And I've never encountered a funder who pushed us for that, but I wish they had.
Yeah, in fact, I think you have these two polar approaches, right? You've got the funders that are all about that. And then, you just need to be a business model type.
Yeah.
And there's a good number of those, especially remember in the hype cycle of the social enterprise years, 2008, 9, 10, in the first 5, 7 years of it, so many nonprofits got derailed because it was a binary way of looking at this. But I've always maintained, and this is true of many of the flagship social enterprises globally, if they're covering 10 to 15% of their operating costs through revenue streams, they're doing very well. It is an important consideration, and especially if you're working with a demographic that does have finances to utilize. You know what I mean? I'm not talking about small children who, depending upon their scenario, if you've got trafficked children or rescued children, where that money is going to come from can only be cross-subsidized. But I'm only looking at families, even if they're low-income families. There's definitely, or communities, there's very much a way to be smart about revenue streams, even if they are long-term patient revenue streams, with long-term returns, long-term paybacks. You're absolutely right, because it's important to think like that in terms of how you design and how you set up. But also you create different kinds of opportunities and you create different kinds of sustainability, and also models that can potentially be replicated by other people with lower operating costs in a way that thing becomes more viable for them altogether. So yeah, I think that's a good point. So I guess the point is more about the fact that funders can play quite a valuable role in encouraging nonprofits to operate better. And I think this goes back to the point you were also making before about funders that challenge you to grow and, to do things in a better way. And this is kind of one aspect of that. Again, if you're a financer in the system, you aren't, financially pressured. So you should have the money to be able to look for these things and to understand these potentials and be able to bring on competence and partners that can help you even understand what good operating models for nonprofits should be like. And then maybe there's some flexibility in there around, again, how you deploy that money for those nonprofits, but also how you allow them to deploy that money in trialing, testing, setting up these kind of, I guess they're innovations in the end, right? Because they're financing and service innovations. And that's a really good point.
Yeah. And I think it's what it would do if it existed, really as a cautious activity, because I'm saying obviously most nonprofits, is that it's easier to get grants from running a nonprofit perspective. It's also tricky to create sustainable revenue generating business models there. Because if it was easy, again, it would be done. And there would be lots of examples. So there are very few examples. And acknowledging that this journey is going to be extremely hard, but it's not a distraction to what you're doing. And I always thought about it as a distraction because I can get money in faster and I can serve my beneficiaries. But what I've realized is that short term, that strategy is correct. But longer term, you can't change that after a few years. That's the other thing I've realized. If you don't have that mentality in from the start and you slowly but surely keep iterating on it. And it's always one of the things that you do. Eventually you will get to something, and eventually you will get to something that I think the 10 to 15% is right. It's not going to be your major revenue stream, but it shifts the power balance between your beneficiaries and yourself so much. It gives you better feedback, and it gives you that additional small amount of unrestricted funding that you can strategically deploy as a CEO. That makes a massive difference. But it's like, if no one tells you and no one pushes you, you have 450 other priorities. If a funder doesn't put that on the priority list, you're not going to, quite frankly.
It's also often a game changer in how funders see you. So it's, the benefits don't lie just in that 10, 50. There's benefits in there for sure, strategic benefits, but they're a multiplier on that. So yeah, I'm fully with you. So before we move on to the future of funding, has there been any time that an interaction with funders has really affected you personally in a negative way? It's really, really got you down?
No, not really. The only thing I put down, and it's not about once we had the funding. We've been quite lucky. We've circulated some funders out, but that didn't impact me personally, because in the team, we were all quite clear that they're not a good funder and they should be circulated out in a acceptable way so that we don't burn our reputation. But we kicked them out. What was tricky and demotivating, I didn't have that many examples, but we did have those occasions where we spend literally months going through due diligence with funders to then get a reply back to say, we don't like your business model. And that they had figured out, and they could have figured out in the first conversation. Does that get you personally? Yes, it does on one level, because it's deeply frustrating and demotivating, but it's also because you've then wasted not only your own time, but typically part of your time in the business development team to not follow on some other leads. And so I think that is sort of the only thing I'd say that can be, it has a direct cost on what you put on others, basically. We had those small handful of cases where, and some of them in the UK, quite high profile funders, where it said like, they're on my red list. We will never, ever work with them or even try to, because they're just wasting our time.
I mean, this is honestly one of the most painful practices. Having a ridiculously long due diligence process and then being rejected on something that, but you knew that before we began. Why did you drag us through this whole path of time and cost and money and demotivation? And those often tend to be those one-way diligences as well. Not the diligences where you feel like, wow, we really gained. We grew and it was fabulous, and we learned, and now we didn't get the money, but we're in a better place at the end of it, which is fundamentally which I feel, again, moral obligation, I feel is the core ethic of good due diligence. Fundamentally at Fractal, and certainly how I do it is, this is my core consideration. Like, your time is going into this, and you may not get money at the end of this. So you better come out winning. Everybody that comes through better come out winning, and you should feel like you came out winning. So at the end, and as an intermediary, I'm in a position to make sure you come out winning. Whether you get this money or don't get this money, I'm always thinking in that interaction, if they don't get this, how are they better placed for the next round? And I feel like funders can do that too. That does tie back to a sense of ethical and moral obligation. It says not just, well, you need money from us, so you need to go through our process, and we're going to, like the 50-page marketing thing or whatever, this is what we need. And doesn't matter to us what effect it has on you. It hasn't even occurred to us. Yeah, that's a great point, which should lead us on to a better world. You've given me a lot already. You've given us a lot. But just more broadly, if you were to think about a future of funding that really generates effective impact for beneficiaries, what would you say needs to change, or what should be in place? What should that look like?
So I put down 3 things, and I think some of it we've already touched on a little bit, but I start with who are the people who take decisions, basically. So if you think about who are the people who took decisions to give us money, they were often like Adele. It was a woman who was made head of CSR, who had previously, I think, run the marketing department. In foundations, you often have people who've been at foundations because they got hired and then promoted for a very long time. And as a result of that, my request would be, if you think about how angel and investment funds work and venture capital funds, there are obviously people who start as a venture capital analyst and then make it to partner at some point. That track exists, and some of them are good. I'm not saying like you can't do it at all, but there is the concept of venture partner. So people who are part-time, who run their own business still, who are doing doing a few deals a year in order to train how to be a good investor, but also they bring in leads and different expertise. And yeah, so I think, if there was one thing, could there be an equivalent of a venture partner role for funders? So people who are not doing this full-time employed and have been there for 10 years, but who have the networks, who have the insights. And then typically, as I said, with venture partners, many of them run their own businesses, have raised their own investment. And that therefore it gives them also the empathy and the insight on how it feels to sit on the other side. And that alone often creates a massive positive, circle from a totally different field. Another example of that is obviously with Apps for Good, we worked at some point then a lot with ministries of education. And one of the key functions that ministries of education do, they write curricula. And often those curricula, obviously, when they then land in the classroom, a total car crash. In Spain, in Catalonia, when I talked with the Ministry of Education there and asked them how they do it, and they said, well, we second teachers for 3 years from their job in the school to the Ministry of Education to help us recreate a new curriculum. And then they go back into the school and they have to teach the curriculum they have created. And as a result of that, we started to get much better curricula, and teachers were much happier about how curricula were developed. No surprise, because obviously if you develop something that you then have to use yourself, you make sure, and you better make sure that, if you have to teach that for the next 10 years, that this is something you really think is worthwhile and you believe in. So I do think if there was a link, that there is not this separation between we're the people who give you money and we're the people who receive the money, but that there was a much more fluid exchange in terms of roles, in terms of capabilities. Now, you can still manage conflicts of interest. I don't think that is a big issue. You need to do it, but that is feasible. But I think that would probably be my biggest thing, because then you would start to get people on the funding, on the allocation side who've been on the other side. And I think then a lot of the really weird things and what we just discussed, endless due diligence without adding value, I think you could kill that really fast, because, you've been through that once. You never want to give that to someone else.
What's really cool about this, without trying to plug Fractal or whatever, that's fundamentally what Fractal is set up to do. That's why anybody that we work with, anybody we bring on, anybody that does it is a practitioner. And in fact, I always try to think about this as two kinds of people that need to come in, which is the people like yourself, myself, who've done both roles, consulting, across sectors, etc., that do some of the technical things. But then people who have spent their lives being CEOs of nonprofits, starting, running, managing them. And then this is an intermediation that is needed in between the funder and the nonprofit for both sides to come our way. That makes sense, because the funder needs insights that they can't generate themselves without that capability. And the nonprofit kind of needs that intermediation to protect impact interests.
And I think the concept of venture partners is it's even a bit closer to the funder, because obviously you become a venture partner, you show up in the team, practically you're always full part-time, and, you don't draw a big salary out of that. So I think there could be sort of an additional thing.
That's a really powerful insight, actually. That piece of having an in-house player that is coming and going, that's not just a vendor or an intermediary. And that's really the long-term dream, right? Basically, you get to a place where you have an intermixed relationship or operating partnership with funders. It's just right now, because that behavior doesn't exist, we're looking at ways to sell that as service. But then the people doing that are people who are still actively involved in the nonprofit sector. That's really been my key goal. Not consultants, not to hire consultants to come in. But that's a really good. So that's the first one, which is basically to try and include or incorporate that venture partner model into the selection pathway. Right.
I think the second we've already touched on, so we can cover it quite quickly. I do think in an ideal world, funders would be the one person in your ongoing day-to-day work who says you need to focus on financial sustainability and we need to experiment with it, and not to let it drop off the agenda, not to push it too hard either. As we said, you don't have to turn your whole thing into a profit-making enterprise when you're serving orphans in Burkina. That's not going to happen. But that does not mean that you cannot find things that still add value to the community that you can commercialize.
think sometimes the people often they feel like commercialization has to take place in the moment of that, I sell, you buy.
Yeah.
Actually, there are, if you think about these as multi-decade time frames where, investments can, or whatever investments you make can result in financial returns for those demographics. And then a part of those financial returns kind of comes back. Then you are doubling, look like your teacher, that the curriculum person that had to then go in, and how you are invested in that community and the amount of effort that you put in to ensure that that community is in fact succeeding with that investment changes, because your revenue model is dependent on that longer term return. So that, I just wanted to add that to the.
Yeah, so maybe call it like patient experimentation of financial sustainability or something. So it has to be patient. And yes, you have to acknowledge it's an experiment, but you have to have a focus on financial sustainability if you want to survive as an organization having impact. So that's my second. And then the last one, I don't think we've talked about yet, but I'll go back to the TuaRes Foundation and what Reinhard has done there. And his overall vision is to enable girls in Burkina Faso, and now also in Benin and Kenya, to get an education who do not have access to that easily because of, socioeconomic background, and to really do well and to then be able to have all the positive effects that come out of, girls' education in the long term, like fewer children, sending your own children to school, like all of those things. But what he's done, and I didn't appreciate that for a long time on how useful that is. But with all of that big vision, he defined one specific KPI that is measurable to decide whether what we're doing adds value or not. And that is not a survey, feedback from the girls. What the data point is it's measuring the exam results of the girls at the end of every school year compared to the rest of the class, and to see how they compare, because typically those girls underperform, I think, by about 30%. And now with all of those interventions, they outperform, I think latest data is 8%. And you might not think 8% sounds great because you think it's 8%. But if you look at like that 32% to 8 underperformance to 8% outperform, that's actually quite massive. And because it's and you can also say those exams are maybe not good exams because they're just about memorizing stuff. Yes, you can have that debate, but the truth is if you go through the school system of Burkina, you don't pass those exams, you're out of school. So it's this one metric that we have that does not inform everything the organization does, but it still validates that hypothesis for the longer term. And it's independent, and it's also, he has reinforced, like, schools who did not want to provide that information got kicked out of the program. Like, there were some head teachers who thought that was a optional addition to the program, and then had to realize that that was not the case, because if that data point wasn't provided, the whole thing, then there would no new goals would be added to the whole thing. But having and finding that metric is, I think it takes experimentation and it takes time. And it's so easy to run a survey and say, oh, we're doing great because everyone says we're fine because, we're giving them money. And, what else would they tell you? Unless you're like horrific, then obviously they might tell you, but otherwise the power balance doesn't tell you that. So to find this one metric that is independent, that you can still measure in a timely way. So as I said, like, it's once a year. It's not like every month. We're not looking at monthly dashboards or whatever, but it's timely enough to also give us an insight as a board of trustees to say, where are we? And there were some years where the 8% was zero. I'm sure if we look back at the last 12 years, I'm sure there was also a year where that was negative, where the girls did not outperform. And we had those waves, but we saw also when that went down, we said, okay, something is now really wrong. Like, what's happening? Because we used to be able to outperform and something has changed, and we now need to understand how can we go back to that level. And it's not a 50% outperformance. I don't think for that audience, that is actually an achievable target at all. And I think Rainer did it because it's his own money he's putting in. He wants to better make sure what he's doing actually makes a difference.
But that's what it should be. You're putting in money, you're taking a stake in the outcome, and you're invested in something that changes somebody else's life. So you need to ensure that there is a marker that independently allows you to track whether or to see whether that individual is on track for the longer term outcome. But also, like, this may be an educational marker. Ideally, then at some point when they exit education, you want to see a life marker that then also shows you the correlation between that 8%, that change in outcomes and something different to the peer set that didn't have that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I think what he's decided is he uses that one marker because that's when the intervention is the highest. And so for him, we have this one marker of success. We look at, yes, how many girls have thrown through the programs. We look at that, how much money we spend. But in terms of what we track in terms of performance, it's literally one thing. And because it's so simple.
Yeah, I can relate. We did the same thing at Make a Difference. The only thing that we did on top of that was I just added the conversion thing at the end. So we had that annual piece that we baselined it to baseline that demographic against their peer set. And then you're tracking that result over time using the big exams also as a critical marker of progression and comparative progression. Then because the hypothesis was that those investments and those changes would result in a later outcome, we also ensure that there was that later marker as well, which is an independent marker. And it is really financial outcomes, sustainable financial outcomes, the socioeconomic outcomes. What that was interesting is that because certainly with demographics that have adverse childhood experiences, some of the reasons why it doesn't convert are nothing to do with their grades. So if we didn't have that marker at the end, we would not have realized that the grade pathway was not causing the life conversion. In the end, we realized that what's happening is that even though we were with support, but the intervention time was getting everybody out with good grades in college. Many funneling into university was excellent. They were coming out of university, but then they were not sustaining the conversion into socioeconomics. And a lot of that had to do with how they didn't fit into middle class environments. So what was happening basically is that what we realized is the programming had to fundamentally change to ensure that not only was that thing working well, but then there was another programming to try and bridge that gap, but also to maintain the bridging post exit of the original program, which is why the programming went from finishing at 16 or 18 and then eventually like 21 to basically looking at it all the way through their first decade of work, really with the tailing off, you're massively reducing it so it could be an interesting consideration because the point is still the same. You're not having many different markers and it's not about how many and where and how and so on, but you're just looking for something critical that you can track. So one is the progression, but then the other one is maybe worth considering is the conversion. Like what that progression is supposed to convert to. And I think too many programs will use other research logic. If this happened over there, so they got this, and therefore those people did great. But sometimes you need to make sure that at least for a cycle that you have confirmed for yourself that with your programming in your geographies, that conversion is adequately taking place. We deviated off. Point is extremely valid.
Yeah.
That simple critical marker. And that if you had a whole portfolio of organizations you were funding, they could all be responding to that marker, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? And then you get a way to compare programmatic efficacy across different types of programmatic interventions across that marker. So I think that's talking from a future of funding impact perspective. I feel that's a fabulous takeaway, actually, a fabulous insight. That I suppose we could fabulously end on. So I'm going to quickly summarize my favorite things that came out of this one, which this was phenomenal, by the way. I thought it was great. I learned some really cool things. I really like the point you made about connection between funding and time frame of intervention. I wish we had a nice little term for that because that's the one thing that doesn't have a term. The other four, moral obligations, designated funding, hybrid models, and patient experimentation. Those are like the 5 big things. And I think we should add the single independent KPI to that list. Yeah.
Maybe it's something like synchronous impact or something, so that you have like an alignment between, and they have sort of how do you call that in English? It's not asynchronous, it's synchronous, so that it goes in the same pace, that the funding and the impact go at the same.
Synchronous funding. Impact synchronous funding. How about that?
Yeah.
So I really
can abbreviate that as ISF. 3 letters is always good.
There we go. ISF. We provided a number of additionalities to the system. All right. This was super insightful. I really enjoyed myself. I learned some interesting new things that I shall have to use if you don't mind. I shall pocket them and spread and utilize them in my work. But I just want to say thank you so much for thoughtful consideration, for sending me the notes and being prepared ahead of time. And yeah, and really finding such a great way to boil down some of those insights into something that can easily be taken away and applied. Thank you very much. I've said I really appreciate it.